Really exciting to be starting our first session here. So I'll just introduce myself. I'm Deborah Harford. I'm the Executive Director of ACT, the Adaptation to Climate Change team at SFU. And we're very proud to be co-hosting the Bridging Silos Conference with the Rural Development Institute and the BC chapter of the Canadian Institute of Planners. So I'd just like to start by acknowledging that where I am working from in Vancouver, I'm on the unceded traditional territories of the Squamish, Musqueam and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And we are very grateful for the privilege to live and work on this land. And if you could each just privately do your own little land acknowledgement wherever you are, that would be wonderful. So just very briefly, ACT is running 4 sessions for the conference. And we are having, today's session is an in-depth session with 4 local government leaders that we've been working with. And tomorrow's session is an in-depth discussion with those leaders. So we want you to just think ahead to that. I'll be talking a little bit about that more towards the end. But so basically today is an introduction to the great work these guys are doing on adaptation and integration with other community priorities. And then tomorrow you'll have an opportunity to come in and have an in-depth discussion with them. This afternoon, we have a session on asset management, which is an opportunity to come and learn from experts in the field of natural asset management and tools that they are using and sharing. Another really great opportunity to learn from experts about key tools and funding. And then tomorrow afternoon, we're welcoming an amazing panel of funders and service providers. And I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end. But that's an opportunity to come and discuss the other aspects of what are the levers for systemic change in Canada? What do local governments need right now? And so it's an opportunity for you to talk to them, tell them what you think, and learn a bit more from them about where they're at with all of that. So I'm just going to show you our agenda for today. I'm going to be finishing this, talking very briefly here, and then handing over to my colleague, Dr. Alison to talk about our initiative that is where our partnership with the local government leaders will be talking to you today. We've got 2 local government leaders talking to you about corporate strategy, Manny Machado from the town of Gibsons and Hilary Elliott from the village of Silverton. And then 2 local government leaders talking about climate action planning in their communities, Laura Sampliner from Port Moody and Kate Letizia from City of Nelson. Once we've had those presentations, we'll be coming back for a sort of dual Q&A. We'll have a Q&A for you to interact right in this session with these 4 leaders. But we're also going to be offering you a place to go to put questions in for our in-depth discussion with these 4 panelists tomorrow afternoon. So I'll be coming back to that later. And then at the very end, we're going to be asking you to do a similar thing, but questions for our funders and service providers for our afternoon session tomorrow. So just to explain ACT's focus in the Bridging Silos conference, we are coming to you to talk about what we call low carbon resilience. And low carbon resilience focuses on the step change that is currently needed in our climate action planning as we start to really try and tackle climate risks. Our communities are dealing with flooding, with wildfire smoke, we'll see increasing heat, we're seeing changes in our frozen, like glaciers, snowpack, and ice. So changes in our water resources, changes in our ecosystems, and all of these things are where our local governments are on the front lines in dealing with these things. And at the same time, there's this incredible pressure to decarbonize the system and reduce our emissions. And what we're realizing is that if we think about these things in an integrated way, we can first of all ensure that we don't increase our emissions with our adaptation actions, and we can ensure that our energy efficiency is resilient and our emissions reduction processes are resilient. But it goes a little bit further than that, because when you start thinking really strategically and systemically, you start to see the opposite, to achieve much more actually and address other community priorities. And so we've been working for 2.5 years with these wonderful folks who are going to be talking to you today in our Integrated Climate Action for BC Communities initiative, which is partly supported by the Real Estate Foundation. It's action-oriented research, so grounded in best practice, but working in research and cutting-edge information that's coming out of the academic world, working with partner communities to co-create and embed low-carbon resilience planning to implementation strategies and develop a framework for action that we'll be sharing with everyone along with guidance tools later this summer. Before we go on, I just realized I'm supposed to ask for a volunteer from the participants today. So everyone that's online here to do a 1-minute report back on this session at the end of the day. So I'm just wondering if we can just have anybody who's be interested in doing that, put yourself in the chat and just say, I'd be willing to do a 1-minute recap of this session at the end of the day. I know there's a brave soul out there who'd be willing to do this. So please do that while I hand over to my colleague here, Alison Shaw, to talk about the low carbon resilience work.
Thanks, Deb. So thank you everyone for joining us for our low carbon resilience stream. We have 4 sessions throughout the next 2 days that we're really excited about. And just to recap what Deb has said, you know, using a low carbon resilience lens not only prevents contradiction in our climate responses, but it presents a step change in terms of transitioning our communities to more sustainable development pathways. It also offers an opportunity for 3 additional elements: managing the avoidable and avoiding the unmanageable. So as Deb said, this is particularly relevant for local governments who are on the front lines of projected climate impacts, as well as are responsible for 50% of the emissions across Canada. Thinking about a low carbon resilience lens, which involves reducing emissions, reducing risk and vulnerability, and advancing co-benefits, also helps us think about costs differently and how to make effective investments. When we're thinking about investing in infrastructure that has a lifespan of 80 years, that infrastructure is going to undergo a lot of changing climate conditions. So we have to think about how resilient the infrastructure is, for instance. And a low carbon resilience lens helps us build in thinking about community resilience and opportunities to start now to transition to our zero carbon goals and targets. Deb? So a key feature of the low carbon resilience lens is the understanding that climate action doesn't occur, and nor should it occur, in isolation. It actually has advantages that can, done well, can actually advance other community priorities relating to economic development, relating to health and equity, and relating to biodiversity, for instance. These are called co-benefits, the co-benefits of climate action, and they're a critical piece of a low carbon resilience approach. Deb? And as Deb mentioned, we're working with communities across the province, different sizes, different scales of climate action. But we've identified 3 main pathways that low carbon resilience can enter local government. The first pathway is on the bottom. It is coordination pathway. So this is for communities that have an adaptation and or mitigation plan and are interested in kind of cross-referencing them to see where there's synergies and trade-offs. And typically this is great for implementation. For instance, we work with the Tsleil-Waututh Nation on the coast, and they have really advanced adaptation and mitigation plans that they've just completed. Now they're interested in coordinating some of the requirements for building standards, emissions and resilience requirements for buildings into design guidelines that can be used by developers in their community. A streamlining approach is a more kind of obvious place for low carbon resilience to enter a local government. It's essentially integrating and streamlining climate action, which is typically done in silos. So adaptation and mitigation planning are typically 2 planning processes in the local government. Low carbon resilience planning process actually we need to combine these because adaptation options and options for reducing emissions are fundamentally interdependent. And so by co-evaluating them together, we can better understand the big wins for our communities. And then the third path is a mainstreaming approach. This is essentially using low carbon resilience criteria. Does it reduce risk and vulnerability? Does it reduce emissions? And how does it advance these strategic co-benefits or community priorities in all decisions, in addition to other criteria such as cost and feasibility? Okay, Deb? So today we're focusing on paths 2 and 3. So the streamlined climate action planning pathway, we have the City of Port Moody and Nelson, who have recently completed their 2 low carbon resilience plans, Deb. Yeah. Which have followed a very typical planning process. I mean, you look at a planning process, it's prepare, engage, assess, plan, implement, and monitor. However, the key features of a low carbon resilience planning process is the critical integrated framing at the beginning of a process in order to develop an integrative mindset among participants that are exploring options for climate action. The other really key feature is, as you can see on the bottom there, performing a risk and vulnerability assessment and emissions inventory and forecast together in one planning session so that you can co-evaluate this data, recognizing that, you know, the types of impacts that a community is going to experience is going to also, the responses are going to also have an impact on emissions trajectories. And so part of what we've learned in building out a low carbon resilience planning process is that through this type of process, where bringing a new concept to the table, we're working across the organization, across diverse departments. And by doing so, and by exposing different departments to the data, the emissions and risk and vulnerability data, we're actually building shared accountability across departments. And in some cases like Port Moody, we're seeing different departments like engineering and parks sharing budget in order to move actions into implementation. Deb? And so the other pathway that we're focusing on today is the path 3, which is a mainstreaming pathway. So mainstreaming low carbon resilience into a municipal planning. I think if you just click, Deb, there's some verbiage there. Thanks. So we have the town of Gibsons and the villages of Silverton here today to talk about how they're using low carbon resilience in corporate strategy and the types of opportunities, benefits, and trade-offs of doing so. And what this means, if you flip forward, Deb, is just applying criteria, a list of criteria, as I mentioned, in addition to cost and ease of implementation or feasibility, asking questions about how a project in a local government reduces risk, reduces emissions, and advances co-benefits. And a great example of this is one of our case communities, the District of Summerland, has actually embedded low carbon resilience criteria into their business and investment planning process. So any project over $10,000 in that community has to advance the discussion on low carbon resilience and address these particular criteria. Deb? And we are excited to be working on a LCR decision matrix that local governments can use to just help them think through what this type of new decision-making criteria alludes to. For instance, looking at not just risks and vulnerabilities in infrastructure, but also in vulnerable populations, vulnerable ecosystems moving forward, developing opportunities and options to build partnerships in order to build adaptive capacity in the community more broadly. And we have, Deb, we have a number of strategic resources that we've co-developed with our partner communities in ICABCCI that are available on ACT's website. And these range from communicating low carbon resilience to mayors and councillors, to showcasing different low carbon resilience interventions that are being used globally, and accounting for natural assets and figuring out proxy valuation tools for accounting for natural assets in communities as a low carbon resilience strategy. And we have a number of tools that are coming out as well that we'd like for you to keep your eye on related to the low carbon resilience planning and business case for low carbon resilience as well. So ICABCCI's main highlights are showcasing that using a low carbon resilience approach in local government streamlines resources and capacity, catalyzes a cross-departmental awareness and collaboration. It elevates the climate action conversation to a systems level so that we're able to look more broadly for partnerships and cross-departmental collaborations to move climate actions forward, developing that shared accountability and in certain cases, shared budgets for implementation. It also promotes an integrative and systemic mindset among staff, council, and service providers. And so we're really excited about some of the outcomes of our community leaders who have taken the initiative to start embedding these kinds of ideas in their communities. And rather than listening from the researcher's perspective, I'd like to let you hear the benefits and challenges of doing so from their perspective. So with that, I'd like to hand over to Manny Machado from the town of Gibsons to talk about low carbon resilience and corporate strategy.
Thank you, Alison. Just prepare my screen here. So let me first start by acknowledging that we're on the I'm on the traditional territory of the Shishalt Nation and the Squamish Nation. I feel very grateful to be living and working here. Natural asset management is to climate adaptation what energy management is to climate mitigation. That certainly is a conclusion that an understanding that we've reached in about 5 or 6 years of trying to embed low carbon resilience in what we're doing in Gibsons, and provide a couple of highlights. We're very dependent on nature to provide the services that we do to our citizens. In fact, climate resilience and infrastructure services are great services that we get from nature itself. And in Gibsons, it's hard to miss. Our aquifer stores and treats our drinking water. Our creeks, forests, and soil combined treat the vast majority of the rainwater that we get in Gibsons. And our foreshore area, still a relatively natural state, and we're restoring some parts of it, provides natural protection for property and people as well. And we benefit from many other services like slope stabilization and coastal protection, carbon storage, pollination, and so on. We're to embed low carbon resilience. We're developing a resiliency framework to integrate low carbon resilience into operations, into decision making and planning, as Deborah was talking about. So what we've prepared is a bit of a dashboard that we use, and it's led by myself in particular with a team of senior staff. Council has determined my position to also include a Chief Resiliency Officer designation, just centralizing climate adaptation, climate change planning in the Chief Administrator's office. So we both identify actions for energy, for GHG reductions, but also for resilience. The framework is aligned with our strategic plan and is what we use. This is our second year that we're using that document to help us work through our budget process. The focus areas there are planning and development, financial planning and risk management, and resource management as well. So just a little bit about financial planning and risk management. You know, natural assets have a lot of advantages over other types of assets, engineered assets. They have no upfront costs, no financial depreciation, they're carbon neutral, and they can last in perpetuity as well if they're properly maintained. Not to mention all the multiple benefits and the multi-purposeness of these assets. We've been embedding these principles into financial planning and reporting. We use business cases for considering a case for nature and capital projects where that's feasible and possible. We fund regularly operations and maintenance of natural areas, including monitoring. It's embedded in risk management and our approach to that policy, and of course, climate change planning as well. I think a bigger question is whether we actually can afford not to maintain these assets if we're clearly dependent on them to provide the services to our residents. And I would also point out to the Insurance Bureau and others across the world that are recommending investments in green infrastructure as a way to mitigate impacts of climate change. I think from a planning and development perspective, the biggest challenge that we see, the biggest transformation and opportunity is to move away from, we have to address the issue of scale, that we can no longer just manage our town planning at the Gibsons level, that we need to move to a watershed scale. I think that's a more appropriate scale. And also the governance itself. We think that we need a collaborative approach for that with multiple jurisdictions and incorporating also Indigenous knowledge and the citizen science that we have a lot of in BC. We consider low carbon resilience also in our official community plans, development permit areas that are specifically designed to manage natural areas like our aquifer protection zone, and fringe area planning as well. The other aspect to consider is our subdivision. There's often a disconnect in local governments between what we ask developers to build and our own ability to maintain it. So we've adjusted our subdivision and development standards to more explicitly recommend preservation of natural areas and mimic infrastructure that is closer to nature as possible. Even our emergency plan is going through an upgrade to include responses to fire and floods and even neighborhood preparedness as well. Our water systems, we're trying to climate proof those areas as well, and we rely heavily on expanding monitoring and cross connection controls of every property as well. 10 years into monitoring, we have higher levels in our aquifer than we had then, and we've grown substantially. It's, I think, proves the value of natural asset management for a delicate asset like that, including our wastewater treatment system that we've had to really beef it up to take more water in shorter periods of time. And we have a greater deal of comfort now, but it was certainly a climate mitigation and proofing upgrade. And that's not to also forget resource management, where we already treat all our biosolids, treat our green waste that we pick up. We don't allow burning for obvious reasons, air quality and so on. And also our organics diversion. We have one of the most successful organics programs in North America with over 47% reduction in what we used to send to the landfill. All of that gets treated into a Class A compost with and it's used locally. Needless to say,
just flagging 2 minutes for you.
Very good, thank you. We're also, needless to say, have a long list of work that's been there in terms of energy and emissions reductions. Our corporate strategy, we've done a lot of work in biofuels and EV upgrades and so on. I think the opportunity at a community-wide scale is in building retrofits, but we're primarily at a corporate scale focusing on the mitigation side of it as well. This is where prioritization in the work that ICABCCI has been done is very important, because even with all the money in the world, we still have a tough time challenging, sort of prioritizing what needs to get done first. And so to that end, what we're working on next is, sorry, there goes my time. Just lastly, just wanted to share with you the fact that we're working on this modeling, which I think it's where it allows us to incorporate about 30 or 40 different variables And this model, it's at a watershed scale, so we can see our own watershed in 3D as a single interconnected system that it is, including the natural systems that are there. And we'll get predetermined questions, but most importantly, we get the questions that we don't know that we don't know. And those are the emergence that comes from, we can better understand, so that when we plant 1 billion trees, we're planting the right trees in the right place. So thank you very much for the opportunity, and I look forward to listening to my colleagues as well and taking questions from you when it's appropriate.
Thanks very much for that, Manny. And then if you just stop sharing your screen, and we'll invite Hilary Elliott, who's the CAO of the village of Silverton, to share your screen there, Hilary. And just reminding people, we'll have a bit of a Q&A after this, and you're also going to have a great opportunity tomorrow for a whole facilitated discussion session with these four on the fascinating leadership work they're doing in this area. So over to you, Hilary. I see your screen coming up. There we go. And Hilary, I think you're going to be talking on the phone, right?
That's correct. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yes.
I can hear you.
Okay, great. So I think you've lost the visual because I had technical difficulties this morning, but hopefully you can see my screen, which you have commented on. So
yeah, we can see it.
Go smoothly. So the village of Silverton, I think it's important to set up the context. We're a population of 195. We are considered a rural remote community. So, you know, we aren't a major center, nor do we have major centers that close to us. We think of Castlegar and Nelson as sort of our larger partners. And with a core staff of 4 people, and our CFO is the City of Nelson, which is part of that collaboration, which I want to know. Something, so I didn't want to forget you guys. So without being able to reach out and figure out how to create partnerships and networking, I really don't think that as a small community we move forward. And so I will start sort of speaking about how that process came about. So first of all, when we first started doing this kind of work, staff and council had a limited and disjointed experience with asset management, with climate adaptation, and with lowering our carbon emissions, as many of you may have heard of the CARE report. So these are sort of the 3 silos that were existing, and was mostly driven by a reactive decision-making element rather than a long-term asset management plan based on knowledge with specific data of the state of our assets and their life expectancies and how all of these things work together. And so I think Manny did a great job of showing how all of these things are related. Everything we do, all of our functions are interconnected, but sometimes we end up separating those things in order to make them more palatable and easy to work with. But then we forget to do that last part of putting it all back together. So our plans usually focused on an asset in isolation from the other assets with limited knowledge of the general state of everything. And this often resulted in scrambling for information. When appropriate, funding was available for a particular asset. And of course, often this wasn't an allocated priority of council. And so it created a huge to-do list of options for staff in terms of funding each year without the highest priorities of council necessarily being addressed. Due to the lack of funding, we really can't do most of our projects without leveraging either our gas tax or some other sort of funding, and our tax base is very, very small. And of course, we get a small community grant from the province, which is one of the reasons we can actually function and move forward. But we have very small budgets with very small wiggle room as to any kind of capital project. So adding to the challenges of the lack of knowledge is also we didn't always know where our assets were because we didn't even have the basic planning. So this is how we started to solve some of those problems. With our limited capacity of staff and limited financial resources, we don't have a planning department, no engineering. We partnered with a consultant and we worked with the regional district of Central Kootenay, who has a GIS did some mapping with the province. So there's some LiDAR work there that we've been able to use, which has been very helpful. As a small community, we literally don't even have GPS points of specific things, which from a planning perspective, as you can imagine, can sometimes be challenging. So we were reaching out and making sure we were talking with our local villages. We've got 2 on the same lake as us. And so this consultant that was willing to work with small municipalities and willing to do a partnership with a bunch of us. In fact, we're spread out. I think there's Grand Force. There's a variety, a few of us that are with this consultant, and we started to do this planning for an open source GIS program, with the concept that this GIS program would be able to be updated by a consultant on an annual basis to allow us to have this basic understanding of what our assets are. Now, of course, how does that then go into our climate adaptation and the low carbon resiliency? Well, that's where having a small staff actually is very handy, because I am the one that basically has my fingers in all projects, and I'm able to put those lenses in that train of thought in what we do. And so that's where having a small number of staff can be very helpful, as well as working with our partners and figuring out how are you doing this and what's working. And that brings us to some actual assets of ours. We are lucky enough to have our potable water from an aquifer. Now that creates other challenges in terms of our watershed is outside of our boundaries. And so it's either provincial or regional district lands, private lands. And so it's a very cross-jurisdictional situation. And so by starting to introduce natural assets and planning for that and figuring out how we're going to put that into a long-term plan with our GIS program, we're able to now start looking for funding and ways to understand how that aquifer is replenished and how that would affect our community if it was contaminated, or if it were to dry up, and what would we do? Well, we do have a lake and we do have a creek, but right now we don't have to chlorinate our water because we have a natural filtration system with the aquifer, and that's something this community values extremely, and something that attracts people. So these are the things that we're trying to, from a long-term planning perspective, with the understanding that climate change, climate adaptation, with climate change, what will happen in our future, if it's drier, if it's not, if we get these rain events, and how does that create or affect our aquifer. So all of these things come into as you can see, they're sort of all coming and melding in together, and so everything we do, we're trying to think about how this works. Not to mention the fact that our storm drains are boulevards, which are grass and trees, and so that's our natural asset of storm management. We don't have a sewer system. We don't have any sort of water system of any kind other than potable water. So these are the resources that we're looking, and we're trying not to create more work for ourselves or more things to look after, rather look after the natural assets that we have in relation to how they also help our more traditional assets of our roads and community halls and that kind of thing function.
Hilary, just one more minute, please.
Thank you. So I just wanted to sort of highlight here what we've been able to do over the past 4 years, essentially on the side of our desk with our partners, which is to map out our natural assets with the QGIS program that then can be utilized to communicate for funding, communicate to the public or to council. Royals Roads is now offering an educational opportunity for natural asset management so that we all have a similar language to speak about in terms of what that means and what we're doing, as well as other educational opportunities through Silverton College, which is where RDI sort of housed, as well as we got our state of climate adaptation from them, and of course working with ACT, SFU, and ICABCCI, really great partners. So I will end it there. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Hilary. That was inspiring. And one of the exciting things about our ICABCCI project is that, we are working with such a wonderful spectrum of communities, all different sizes, all different stages of climate action. So now I'd like to hand over to Laura Sampliner, Sustainability and Energy Coordinator at the City of Port Moody. Welcome, Laura.
Thanks, Deb. Share my presentation. Excellent. So good morning, everyone. I'm pleased to join today from the traditional ancestral and unceded territories of the Coquitlam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Coast Salish peoples. And I'll just be sharing some insights from Port Moody's journey in using our low carbon resilience framework to guide development and implementation of our first climate action plan. So previous to developing our climate action plan, Port Moody had expired community and corporate greenhouse gas reduction targets and was doing climate work sort of off the side of our desks. And as of July 2020, we now have an integrated climate action plan that looks at both corporate and community reduction of greenhouse gas emissions and adapting to future climate change scenarios. And so this integrated planning approach was achieved by utilizing the low carbon resilience framework and co-developed with the SFU ACT team, which we're happy to be involved with the ICABCCI project. So the plan includes 54 actions spanning 8 different focus areas and was developed by various groups as shown on the screen. And we've been working to integrate low carbon resilience now from the beginning of our plan development all the way through continuing to our implementation stage that we're hitting now. And so by using the low carbon resilience framework, Port Moody experienced several benefits that we think would not really have occurred otherwise or would not have really been experienced to the same degree without LCR. So the first one is that staff were originally asked to develop a climate action vision, a community energy and emissions plan, and a climate adaptation plan, all in 3 separate documents. And so by using the low carbon resilience lens, we were actually able to undertake only 1 planning process to produce a more fulsome climate action plan document that addresses all 3 of those areas. And so as you can imagine, that saves us significant time and resources only having that 1 process. And by doing this, we were able to get a lot of different staff from almost every city department in the same room. And it removed a lot of walls and disconnect between the different departments and divisions in our community. And so similarly, this also breaks down a lot of silos and just creates general greater understanding of where climate mitigation and adaptation overlap with city staff work plans and other city priorities, and really increase the buy-in and ownership of implementation of these actions. And so using the LCR, we think there is also a wider pool of external funding that is probably available to us and could also give us a greater success chance in applying to these funding applications by using the low carbon resilience framework that's sort of innovative and new in this area. So hoping it gives us a bit of an edge. And I'll just touch on lastly, because of the co-benefits and alignment expressed through the LCR approach, we are now integrating climate action in many of the facets throughout our organization. And that includes looking at different plans and policies and just the overall mentality of our staff and coordinating budgets, as Deb and Alison mentioned. And I won't go into detail about this yet, but the barriers we experience were not really specific to low carbon resilience, and were sort of the typical barriers that you would experience along any planning process, especially developing a plan. That largely includes financial and resourcing constraints and getting staff to consistently participate, and starting from a place where climate action was not really a priority or talked about largely in our organization. So not really anything out of the ordinary. So just go into some examples of what low carbon resilience looks like in implementation, since that's what we're focusing on right now in Port Moody, and some of the tools we use, noting that we're just kind of starting this out. So a lot of this is still draft. But we're undertaking an action right now to develop a zero emissions climate resilient plan for all new and existing buildings in Port Moody that largely looks at commercial and residential buildings. And this is likely taking a neighborhood scale approach to retrofitting buildings. And at the same time as those mitigation retrofits are occurring, we're trying to understand where climate vulnerabilities exist within these structures and timing improvements for reducing climate risk and vulnerability at the same time as those upgrades or retrofits that would help reduce emissions. And so on the new building side, this involves doing a scan of local government tools and mechanisms to make sure that our buildings are zero emissions and resilient when they're first built. And in order to really track our success in each of these actions and in the climate action plan in general, we're using project management software and asking staff to provide monthly updates on the status of each of the actions by reporting out on some of these key performance indicators that look at both climate mitigation and adaptation. So another level of LCR in there. I'll just go into some examples of the tools that we used throughout the development of our plan to really help us embed LCR in our climate action plan. And so we used, I think this was a similar table was shown earlier in Alison's presentation, but we used LCR-focused action evaluation criteria that really help staff to understand where the intersections of LCR are within each action, and then actually provide a score for that in each action and be able to evaluate some of these key criteria that make up the actions that will end up in our climate action plan. And then we included a lot of LCR explanations and verbiage in our climate action plan itself, and including that spectrum that shows where Port Moody previously was on our scale of low carbon resilience and where we are now with adoption of our climate action plan. So including some of those important definitions in there to really frame up mitigation and adaptation and using that consistent language. Some of the planning tools that I just mentioned resulted in elements like these in our climate action plan that help to communicate a lot of the co-benefits of integrated climate action planning and where mitigation and adaptation planning in the same stream help to overlap with other municipal and community priorities, such as reducing burden on city infrastructure and improving health and well-being and community livability. And we continue to actually use a lot of these same communication pieces with our climate action work that's continuing and with our community and now with our decision makers at the city. So I'll just go into that a little bit. We're working now on how we can really help our community make those important decisions on funding climate action work. And so staff are experimenting with communicating different verbal examples of the benefits of investing in climate action, both adaptation and mitigation. So I've just sort of highlighted some of where this overlaps with low carbon resilience. And some of those outcomes that we expect to be seen, such as expanded co-benefits, increased collaboration opportunities, avoiding future costs when compared to traditional siloed climate planning. And along with this, staff are including interpretation about the effect that each of these climate actions will have on either reducing emissions or increasing climate resilience, along with the co-benefits anticipated for each action. And I will note that the effect is based on staff expertise and not actual modeled results, but just trying to communicate some of those impacts to our decision makers.
Laura, 1 minute, please.
Okay, sounds good. And we've also categorized different climate actions based on criteria as either quick wins, best bets, or major projects that includes both considerations for mitigation and adaptation, just to help communicate where these overlaps and synergies are between both streams of climate planning. And so I'll leave it on this slide, but here's just a quick checklist of a lot of the tools that we use throughout planning and implementation. And that helped us to either embed or highlight low carbon resilience along the process of developing our plan and now going through to implementation. And so I'll leave it there, but I'm happy to answer any more questions or details about Port Moody's low carbon journey. So I'll stop there.
Oh, thank you so much, Laura. And so we have a question for you in the chat, but what I'd really like to do is save that for our Q&A session that's going to be coming up, because I'm sure others will like to hear your response. So thanks very much, and please do feel free to put questions into the chat, especially with the name of the person you want to ask it to. And for now, though, we're going to hand over to Kate Letizia from Climate Change Coordinator at the City of Nelson for our final local government champion presentation, and then we'll move into our Q&A. Welcome, Kate.
Great, thanks so much. Get quickly set up here. All right, I realize my window is still showing there, but we'll have to leave it at that. Everyone can see the slide?
Yes, that looks great.
Okay,
We can
so
see
yes,
it.
I'm going to move really quick. I know we're running low on time, so I'm Kate Letizia. As Deborah said, I am the Climate Change Coordinator for the City of Nelson. We are located on the traditional territories of the Sinixt, Salix, and Ktunaxa people on the Kootenay Lake in the southern interior of BC. We're the commercial and population core of the West Kootenay region, population about 10,000, but it's a lot larger than that when you consider our tourism and commuters. So Nelson And I will add also, our experience has in very many ways mirrored Laura's, and she did a brilliant job explaining their process. And rather than repeat a lot of that, I'm going to focus a little bit more on one specific thing that we did around engagement. But very quickly up front, similar to Laura's experience around the way our planning and policy and engagement and decision making sort of looked before low carbon resilience. Nelson certainly has always punched above its weight in size in terms of action on the environment and climate change, but we were sort of stuck with in a space with these long-term, common theme focused climate plans, really focused on mitigation. Our adaptation planning was already integrated in many ways into our water master plan, our emergency response and wildfire processes, also happening sort of ad hoc, but we did not have a specific strategic plan around it. And we were certainly sort of splitting work from a community corporate perspective. On the engagement side, very much city-led, more on the informed consult side of the engagement spectrum, a technical and environmental sort of expert focus at the table to inform our plans, and certainly pretty traditional decision-making criteria that made sense, cost, feasibility, impact, with more of a mitigation focus for sure. So just really quickly looking at our sort of policy hierarchy, actions were coming from some of the strategic planning on the mitigation side that was going on, or some sustainability planning that connected, or they were coming from our more subject-specific plans on the adaptation and mitigation side, leading to bylaws, policies, programs that were in some ways disconnected. So yeah, certainly we were starting to notice that a lack of a coordinated, integrated approach was really starting to create some challenges and limitations. Capacity, very much an issue, constantly punching above our weight. We needed to figure out a way to streamline planning as well as program delivery so that we could make some space for all this work. So to address all of this, we decided to change our way of working from the get-go. We knew that low carbon resilience made sense for us right off the hop for a lot of the reasons Laura just mentioned and the others have mentioned. We dove into trying to integrate and surface co-benefits from the outset in our planning process, from our taking stock work, figuring out what's already going on and how it might already be connected or what co-benefits are happening, all the way to our research activities, our engagement, and definitely similar to Laura's experience, our decision-making was extremely focused on the concurrent mitigation and adaptation connections, synergies, and of course the co-benefits. The idea was that this would lead like our new plan toward a shift in, de-siloed behavior around mitigation and adaptation, but it would also start to help us figure out not just how to integrate those two issues, but also just firmly integrate climate action into how we work, policies and processes, problem solving, decision making. So the thing I was asked to focus on in terms of our process was community engagement, and it was definitely a highlight of our process and our LCR experience. I will preface that already as a policymaker, I was coming to the table with a very keen interest and bias toward really in-depth participatory engagement. And I'll say that adopting an LCR lens to build our policy, I think made good engagement even more important. So are the needs around engagement when utilizing LCR terribly different? Not necessarily. The basic critical success factors are similar. Engagement has to be democratic, equitable, co-creative as always, but I found that with LCR, that was even more critical, if anything. We are in fact asking people to shift mindsets and defaults yet again, and rethink and de-silo some processes and structures that have been built with great care to do really important work. And this can be really uncomfortable and hard to do even with allies. Thankfully, systems thinking, language and imagery, as you can see here from this brief snap, was really helpful for us. It made sense to folks to have a larger and more diverse space for new voices. It was exciting to look for new synergies and opportunities when framed this way, and to learn new ways of creating mutual value. So, instead of asking people to, ditch that somewhat siloed but good idea you've been working on for years that we've had trouble integrating, not very exciting for folks, but asking them to come to a table with new players to figure out ways to make it even more impactful, give them the space and time for that, look for new collaborators, show them about new funding ops when they've got a co-benefit around a social element, try it in the real world. Yes, people were excited about that. So I won't go into the specifics of our approach. I don't have time for it. It was in depth. I would just highlight, we broadened the circle of actors at the table. We attempted to make the divisions between them as blurry as possible. Everyone's a climate actor. A variety of activities occurred, as you can see here, inspired by systems thinking and the design thinking process. We carefully moved the community as best we could out of the default boxes and into more of a shared space and mindset that was more interested in multi-solving and integration. And of course, this was just the beginning of the work, this set of engagement activities, and it was done during a pandemic, so there's a lot left to do. Next. So one specific aspect I really wanted to highlight quickly at the end here that worked really well in terms of overcoming some of those, some of the challenges around engagement on this subject was a social lab we called Nest Lab. And, you know, we practiced what we preached. We developed it with Interior Health and Nelson at its Best, a social services organization, to show from the outset, we're looking at all different ways to connect and integrate. And essentially it was an engagement program built around the convening question you see here. And it was focused on deliberately bringing diverse spectrum of Nelsonites together across sectors and experiences to engage with one another long-term and develop some innovative LCR solutions and actually test them. And solutions that actually aligned with their lives and context and energy were sort of where they were already at. And so that was super appealing to a lot of folks here. And of course, it also helped inform our policy and our plan. And so we took this group through the stages of building trust, clarifying shared intentions and leverage points, and developing a portfolio of LCR prototypes to try in the real world. And I can't go into much more detail, but it worked really well. I have a lot more detail to offer at another time, and we plan to keep it going into the implementation stage of our plan and hopefully beyond. And so what we sort of ended up with, magic surprise, you know, was also a new climate plan that I didn't have time to speak about, but I can at another time. And a lot of these improvements here on the screen, very similar to what Laura already described, so I won't repeat. And I'm done in 7 minutes and 45 seconds.
You rock, that's amazing. All right.
We'll put it.
Go team. So I'm gonna just introduce our Q&A session now. So you've heard from our 4 local government leaders. As you can see, all with really interesting different levels of focus, different starting points, but all on the same page and working towards solutions that integrate the key actions on climate that we are all trying to show up for here, and also address other community priorities at the same time. And so what we're going to do now is we're going to go into a Q&A period, and I see there's a question in the chat for Kate and one for Laura. I do encourage you to put other questions in there, and we'll be asking those in just a minute. But as you can see from these really wonderful, well-timed, short and pithy presentations, there is so much to unpack about how these local government leaders have brought together this action, what they had to do to mobilize this. Much of this actually has been going on during the pandemic, so it's just been an incredible confluence of events. And so that's what we're offering tomorrow morning, 10:30 till noon, is an opportunity to come and talk in depth with these guys. Bring your own community thoughts and progress and questions, and workshop some of that with us tomorrow morning. And so I'm going to hand over to, we're staying here for the Q&A for now, for those of you who may not be able to come tomorrow morning or have urgent questions, such as the ones people have already put in the chat. So please stay, we want to have that discussion live now. But we also want to gather a few quick thoughts now that you're fresh on seeing what these guys are doing, to whether or not you can attend tomorrow. Interesting questions you think would be good for them to answer. So I'm going to hand over to Keisha Talsma, who's our program coordinator for the ICABCCI project, to introduce how to use that tool, which we'll be using again at the very end. And then we'll come back for the Q&A. This will just take a minute. Over to you, Keisha.
Awesome. Thanks, Deb. So yeah, I can see some of you are already getting into it. I love that. So we're just going to be using this interactive tool called Menti to collect, and we can also upvote some of the questions for our panelists tomorrow. So what we're asking you to think about is just really in depth, what would you like to learn more about from these panelists during our March 5th morning session, so our session tomorrow. And if relevant, it'd be great to include the panelist name also so that we can direct questions to them. So really easy to get to this screen. So you're just going to go to menti.com on your phone or your computer, and the link and the code is actually already in the chat. And you just enter this code at the top. So 394892. And once again, that is in the chat for you. And it will just direct you to this screen here. And then all you need to do is click open Q&A, and then you can put your question in at the bottom there. And we'd love if people could use this upvote function, this thumbs up on the right-hand side there, just so we can keep track of the top questions for tomorrow, and pull out any really interesting themes as well. So I'll turn back over to Deb, and I'm going to close this screen so we're not distracting everybody, but this will still remain open for you to ask and continue to upvote your questions. So back over to you, Deb.
Great, thanks so much, Keisha. Yes, it's great. We very much look forward to seeing your questions and addressing those tomorrow. And as Keisha said, she's got the link in the chat there, so you can just click on that. It'll take you to the screen, and you just copy and paste that code over. And then please also upvote questions so that we know, if you go there and you're like, well, I was going to ask that, but I'm not going to duplicate it. So, but I do think it's an important question. Do please indicate that by voting for that question. But so now let's just put our view on gallery. Now, if you look down at the bottom right of your screen, you should see a reactions button. If you click on that, there is a raise hand option. And so if you want to ask a question, you're going to be able to just raise your hand. You've got two options here. You can either put a question in the chat and indicate who you'd like us to ask it with, and I'll just moderate that for you. Or you can unmute yourself, and we'd love to hear voices. It is that strange Zoom land that we're all in. So it's always nice to have that human contact, and we do welcome that. So please click a raise hand, and we'll call on you to unmute yourself as we go through the questions here. And I also just want to reiterate, we are looking for a volunteer from the participants. There's lots of you on this call, but we're still looking for a volunteer to give a 1-minute overview of what you saw in this session at the end of the day. That's a request from the Rural Development Institute. So I'm going to keep plugging away and hoping we'll get a volunteer on that. So feel free to volunteer in the chat. Okay, so let's go to the questions that people have put in here. So I'm going to start with Lindsay Allman's question for Laura. So Laura, for Port Moody, what department takes the initiative to create and monitor these plans? And I think this means this integrated plan. How many new positions were created to make this come to fruition?
Thanks for that question, Lindsay. That's a good one, and I can provide more detail, but I'll just give a brief summary of what's happening with that. So there were no new positions created to actually develop the plan. It was developed by our policy planning division, and we have specifically only one position that's responsible for climate action in our community. So that position took the lead on this and worked with a consultant to develop the plan, as well as with the ACT team and a few other players in our community. On the implementation side, for our first wave of implementation, that's about 40% of the actions in our plan are being proposed to be initiated through our implementation plan for 2021 and 2022. We're asking for 4 new positions. So one of those would be to help monitor and continue implementation of the climate action plan itself and those different phases of implementation, and a couple others are for various other departments like environment and parks and engineering, just to help reinforce the work that needs to get done for those actions. But largely we were able to capitalize a lot through using LCR on giving ownership or passing that ownership off to other departments who are now leading a lot of the implementation through their own staff. And this was communicated to them through a lot of those co-benefits that align with their already existing priorities on their work plans or other city strategic plans, that they're able to align a lot of that work and just undertake it themselves. So hopefully that answers your question. Great,
thanks very much for that, Laura. Lindsay says thanks. We do, encourage anybody if our panelists' responses spur thoughts in your mind, please do follow up with a follow-up question. That would be great. So let's just move to another question in the chat from Kathy Moore. This one is for Kate, and a great presentation, Kate. How successful were you at getting different people from the community to participate, and how many people did join your efforts?
Okay, Thanks, Kathy. Well, I think you might be asking about that in particular around the Nest Lab. If not, I can expand. But when it came to the lab where we were really deliberately trying to make that happen, I'd say we were quite successful. We used 3 different pillars of sort of diversity to bring new voices to the table, and that was around demographic diversity. We wanted all sorts of different people at the table, and that way it was around sort of your experience or exposure to climate change and where your head was at around the subject as well. We wanted a big diversity there. And then the other pillar was around just your general professional and lived experience, and trying to bring as many different voices to the table in that way. And we had a number of applicants from a broad spectrum and all those different pillars. And I feel we brought a really interesting group of table and a number of voices to the table that wouldn't have been there before, that could also connect with a few of the voices that would, and that they likely haven't been exposed to voices like that in the past. And it worked really well. And we're ramping up those efforts for phase 2 and trying to include even more diverse voices and have a larger number coming into the lab for the next phase. I hope that answers.
Kate, can you just talk about how many people are involved in Nest Lab?
Sure.
And then how many people your LCR outreach touched?
Oh, okay. Well, the lab in particular, it was a bit of a prototype itself and an experiment. So we did start small. We had about 17 people join to start, and the pandemic hit and we lost a few, but so it's about 15. But we also have about over 20 people and a handful of different organizations, as I mentioned, some of them supporting the lab in different ways, either as advisors, champions, convening partners, etc. And again, we're expanding that for phase 2. We're looking to have about 30 folks in the lab as participants, and add a bunch more partners to the table to help run and inform the lab. In terms of the broader engagement, I don't have a person number, and it was pretty complex and convoluted with everything moving to online last minute, but we definitely had over 10,000 connections. So we did a lot. We got out there as much as possible.
That's fantastic, Kate. Thank you so much. And there's one more question for you that's really related to what you're talking about. So I'm going to just ask that one next, and then there's a really big question for the whole panel. You mentioned an engagement survey with First Nations, and I'm sorry, I can't see the person's first name. Last name is Sudan. They're just asking how the engagement survey with First Nations went, and which First Nations you were able to engage.
Mm-hmm. I think that's Sangita from the RDCK. Hi, Sangita. I just did a presentation on this a couple of days ago, so I'm getting confused. Essentially, I will, speak openly about this. It didn't go great. We put a letter out to all of the nations with claim on our land here in Nelson, and told them about what we were doing, and introduced ourselves and our work, and then asked, developed a survey to learn more about their specific protocol and the different ways they would like to be engaged. And sadly, we only had 2 return responses, and both nations that responded opted not to participate. So we have a lot of work to do to learn from that and fix it. And we just applied for funding for phase 2 of our lab to actually figure out a way to integrate Indigenous voices at the planning level and at the sort of capacity building level with participants, and work with local Indigenous groups to make sure that we're creating space in the lab for Indigenous participants to come and be successful. So that's going to be a major focus for phase 2 of the lab. And we have other plans in place for increasing engagement with Indigenous folks as we move forward with our plan, learning from our previous experience.
Great, thank you so much for that, Kate. Yeah, it's very exciting. The community, I think people often underestimate the importance of communications, and it really does take almost a whole other skill set around engagement. So that's really exciting to hear about that. Thanks a lot. So I've got 2 questions here that I'm going to put out to the whole panel. And so I'll just kind of let you guys jump in. And I just want to remind our participants that we have 5 more minutes for questions here, and you still have 5 more minutes to add questions to our mentee collection. We're getting some fantastic questions coming on there for our session tomorrow morning. So please do take a look at that and keep adding your thoughts. Keisha's just put the link there again. And you do also have another 5 minutes here to ask questions of our panel. So take this opportunity to pick their brains. So I'm going to ask Gail's question. Gail Morton's asking a question to the whole panel, a really important question. Our local government has much on their plate with homelessness and infrastructure and doesn't seem to have a climate plan. Do you think it's a good idea for the city to give the climate plan as an addition to another city job, or create a new position? And how would a new position be funded when funding is so scarce? So any responses from panelists to any part of that question, and I'll be happy to read it out again, as it is quite a complex question, but it's a really important one, and I think you'll probably resonate with it. So who'd like to go first? Manny? Okay.
Yeah, certainly. We feel overwhelmed just about every day with everything going on. And let's just say that since COVID, and with COVID, what has translated into it's that we're doing more than we're doing before with 60 or 70% of the resources at best. And so we're all burned out, but we're trying to get through it. In the meantime, there's no really an option to put what we've been talking about on hold. It's not doing everything you need to do and then you do climate planning. It is what we do. It is in everything from emergency planning to how we maintain. What, interestingly enough, when COVID happened, that caused that we first anticipated to put a lot of stuff on hold, but eventually we did a lot of the work because we wanted to make sure that was all running as smooth as possible. We first started by amending the job descriptions of the people that we have, and we organize ourselves differently. It's what you do in sort of operating in a system like this. So we've got 3 main teams, and I also coordinate those teams and work with, I take roles in within each team. So, and we've added a natural asset management technician. It's not that we just crafted that job to incorporate. It's like a geotech, an engineering tech, but for natural areas, because that's where we saw a lot of the demand for that type of work, and including the climate emergency that we're dealing with. So that's some of the things that we've done. I don't think we will hire too many more people in the future, to be honest. We probably partner with our regional folks first as a next step, and then bring in consultants if needed.
Thanks, Manny. I just want to give Laura, Hillary, or Kate, one other panelist, an opportunity to respond to this question. Laura?
Yeah, I'll work from the bottom up, try to answer. So yeah, we've struggled a lot with funding positions and that capacity, the balance between the needed capacity and then the constraints on funding. One of our strategies for funding wise is, look for external funding opportunities when possible. So FCM has some staff grants. There's other organizations that can provide some additional capacity, even if it's a summer student looking at certain projects that are a priority. That's always helpful. We're taking a big look at, trying to prioritize pulling from our reserves and largely looking at capital funding sources to keep our taxes low for our residents. That's a priority in our community. So if there's reserves, if you get your carbon tax back through your CARE reporting, that's how my position's funded. So there's some workarounds that can help to pull money from different places. And once you start communicating the benefits, that might create a greater business case for adding a new position if that's your priority. But there's also some really great overlap between the struggles it sounds like your community is facing and integrated climate action work. So for example, we're looking at creating emergency relief centers in all of our city facilities or where possible, and prioritizing that in situations of extreme heat or flooding or natural disasters, that kind of thing. So that includes a lot of priority for our homeless populations and thinking about those vulnerable populations in there. So there's a lot of co-benefits to that, as well as looking at how to upgrade our parks and our natural environment to be cooling relief, outdoor cooling relief in times of extreme heat. So that also really impacts our vulnerable and homeless populations as well. So there's a lot of things that you can sort of look at to help build a business case for a new position, or for adding it into a position that oversees some of those areas as well. So just my 2 cents.
Great, yeah, thanks so much, Laura. That's wonderful. Now we're almost done here, but there is one great question here from Meredith for the panel, but I think anybody else in the audience. Other examples that you know of local governments going to First Nations rather than First Nations being invited into local government processes. So, you know, flipping that script a little bit in terms of we're doing something, we're trying to engage the First Nations, but sort of going to them more as like an initiating a collaborative project, or being invited in by a First Nation for a local government to engage, to participate in their project, if you like. So anybody on the panel have any thoughts on that, or anyone in the audience? Yeah, well, it's an interesting, it's a really good question, and this is why we need to think more about this. And I think we are seeing some of that here. We're working with the Tsleil-Waututh Nation. They are very much, they are leading a wonderful dynamic process, very much based on guidance from their elders and their traditional food practices, looking at the health of the Burrard Inlet and how they could do a green stormwater plan that helps to adapt to climate, and while specifically trying to rehabilitate their food fishery and ensure that it stays healthy into the future. So I think there's some great leadership coming up in that regard, and we'll look forward to more innovation in that way coming forward. So we're going to invite you back for tomorrow morning with this wonderful set of people for an in-depth discussion around climate future in BC, what it's going to look like, what we need to think about, how we backcast from there to ensure that we're keeping our emissions down, and benefiting our climate, ensuring we're not vulnerable to climate risk, and also benefiting other community priorities such as equity, social justice, biodiversity, and health. We've got a comment from Rhiannon here, not technically First Nation, but Indigenous. There's a National Maori Climate Network here in New Zealand. Rhiannon, are you in New Zealand? That's exciting. We've got someone from New Zealand on the call. There's a National Maori Climate Network here in New Zealand worth looking into. Hillary, did you want to speak?
Hi, Deborah, thanks. I was just going to comment in that I've done a bit of work with First Nations regarding a variety of different initiatives that we've done in reconciliation. And in working with the Akanaki, which is the Tanaha over Preston area, I believe that creating relationships with First Nations all the time is really where you need to work, just like you would with any other community, really. And then when you have that relationship, you understand when there's synergies and things that you can work on together. And I think that that's really the most respectful way for people that have not engaged with First Nation communities before, or finding it daunting. Really, I just reached out and was just saying, I don't know what I'm doing, I don't know what's happening, and was quite a really warm welcome from that particular community. And of course, every community is different, so you'll just have to get to know every First Nation community, just like every local government community.
Yes, thanks very much, Hillary, and that's such an important comment. You know, each community is unique, and relationships and trust take time, and we need to allocate the resources for that.
And there's just on that note, Deb, there's different ways of operating too. There's different approaches among First Nations. And I think this should be a call out to Jeanette Armstrong, who's speaking tomorrow as part of the Silks First Nation. And Jeanette has been a critical resource in terms of writing about the Silks process, the Anilkan process, which is vastly different from how local governments work and local government hierarchical decision-making. So I would just encourage you to watch Jeanette Armstrong's presentation tomorrow.
Fantastic. Thanks, Alison. Well, in this last minute that we have one more Menti opportunity for you. So Keisha's going to put this in the chat. We have our meeting tomorrow afternoon with Infrastructure Canada, the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, ICLI Canada, All One Sky, and the Community Energy Association. These are the folks who are making this work possible, both from on the ground right through to making networks and funding. And we want to gather questions. We're gathering questions in each of this session, our afternoon session today on asset management, and then our morning session back with these folks tomorrow, giving you an opportunity at each one of those to put in key questions. How do we scale this climate action up? What do local governments and other folks need right now from funders and service providers to really get this work widespread, accessible, affordable, etc. So please click on that link and give us your thoughts. For those folks, we'll be bringing forward the top 2 or 3 questions that emerge from that. And it's a really great opportunity to come and talk to the people who are making a lot of this possible, to tell them what you need. And they would like to know some information from you too. So we may have the panelists flipping their script and asking the audience some questions. And with that, we will leave it for this morning. Thank you so much. I hope you have a wonderful conference. It's really exciting to be able to gather like this, even though we couldn't meet in person as we had originally planned. And so welcome from as far away as New Zealand. And we very much look forward to the rest of this exciting 2 days. Thanks very much and have a nice lunch. And we will see you this afternoon and tomorrow. Thanks to our panelists, of course. Wonderful work. Thanks, everybody.